Haque.com.
The theory of evolution has posed problems for believers who would have thought simply that God created us. So how does evolution fit in with the idea that God created us? Well, let's turn to our guest and get the answer. Brother Nadim, how do you reconcile the theory of evolution with belief in the Creator God?
Yes, this is a very touchy subject for a lot of people, but actually the interesting thing is that it was Al-Jahiz in the 8th century.
Who was Al-Jahiz?
He was a Muslim writer and you could say a scientist too, someone who observed nature. And he's the first person to really talk about macroevolution in terms of species changing from one to the other. But he talked of it in terms of a law of God. So it wasn't something which was based on chance or natural selection.
How did he come to this idea that this happens?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. How could they think of that 1,400 years ago? Because the Greeks didn't even have those ideas. So I think that it's just the nature of the Quran in terms of maybe the way it makes you think, that things transform, things change. There are verses that are definitely talking about evolution. We know that for sure. For example, the evolution of the stellar systems. It says God turned to the heaven when it was smoke, or gaseous particles, smoke, dust particles, and said to it, come, willingly or unwillingly, and they said, become willingly. Now we know that when there's a supernova explosion, when a star goes supernova, it compresses other gases around it and they rotate, and then these become the star in the center and the planets around. So yes, there's evolution there. Then the issue is, what about biological evolution? Could that have occurred? And I think that these people really...
And most troubling in the area of biological evolution is that many champions of the theory of evolution seem to be presenting this as an alternative to the belief that God created us. So it's a dichotomy as the way it is presented. Either you believe that God created you, or you believe that you evolved through a long history of microscopic changes.
Yeah, because I think that the idea, evolution is just a process. Where's the mind which directs?
So you don't see that there's a dichotomy there between the two. It's not an either or. You can have both and.
Yes, and indeed the word in the Quran, for example, that we created this universe in 6 stages and the earth in 4 stages. Yaum, the word yaum, it doesn't mean 24 hours. It's translated as day, for example, but actually it's period. That's what it means in Arabic. It could be billions of years, or it could be a picosecond.
So is there room for Muslims believing in the Quran to say, yes, it's possible that God used a process called evolution by which he created biological life?
Yes, indeed. But from my research, and I've written a book which is going to be published soon, inshallah, I've actually shown that the Quran does talk of even macroevolution, and it's through the idea of clay. For example, when it says that we created you from clay, it's not the clay, but the constituents of the chemicals in the clay. For example, it says that we created you from min nutfa, from the seminal fluid. It's not the seminal fluid, it's the germ cell in the seminal fluid. So the word min means that which is in. And recently, James P. Ferris, he has actually discovered that Montmorillonite clay is a clay which can combine nucleotides to produce RNA. And RNA, when it becomes more complicated, or then it can lead to DNA and the whole of life. Because if you just have RNA, how are you going to produce RNA? It's very complicated. And the probability for doing that is astronomically, it's impossible almost. You see?
But when scientists are experimenting like this, they obviously work with the idea that God is irrelevant to the whole process. And they try to discover natural causes and their effects. But in doing it in that way, aren't they in a way excluding God from all of our thought process?
Yeah, they're excluding God, but what we have to do is we have to, I think the truth of the matter is that God initially created the universe the way it talks about in the Quran through the Big Bang, and he set about devising the particles in such a way that they would form a developmental path. And indeed, the Quran talks about we have created a heaven full of paths. So it's these pathways. And these pathways, the reason why they develop is through the idea of balance, mizan. So for example, if I'm pushing two things together, they won't move if I have an equal force, okay? But if this force is greater, then it's going to move. So the way development, and indeed even evolution happens, which I've shown in my book, has to do with the idea of mizan. And I call it quasi-equilibrium. For example, if I'm seated like this, I'm not going to fall. But if I seat further back at a certain angle, there's going to be enough force downwards that I'm going to fall. So I have to reach a critical mass to fall. So I believe that that's how evolution occurs. This is a theoretical part of my work, that there's a mechanism which has to do with balance, changing of the balance in the genome. When it reaches a critical mass, then a cascade occurs, and the genotype, that's the gene, changes, and then the phenotype changes. That's why you have periods of long periods where there's no change, and suddenly you have a change. Because it has to reach a critical mass for change to occur. But it can't happen by natural selection, because with natural selection, the problem is that you have this mutation. They say it happens due to mutation, but mutations are deleterious. They're harmful, most of them.
So you seem to be saying that without God, this whole thing cannot work.
No, it can't work, because everything is just a process then. Process doesn't have a mind.